We are really happy to have you today with us. Could you please just introduce yourself with a few words and coming back to a few key moments that brought you here today, actually?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Can people hear me without the mic, or do you need me mic'd?
Whatever you...
Mic is better. Yes, I'd be happy to. So my name is Victoria Espinel. I'm the CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. And you know, my career has been a series of really serendipitous, lucky circumstances that all kind of built on each other. So I can tell the story of my career in a way that makes it sound
That's really humble of you, but
yeah,
okay.
no, it's true. Like, I can tell it in a way that would make it seem like it was planned, but actually much of it was unplanned, happy coincidences. But in terms of moments that got me here, there are many. I'm gonna mention three jobs I had before this, all of which I felt like taught me something that has been useful along the way. And I've had more than 3 jobs, I'm picky. So the first one that I'll talk about is when I went to the London School of Economics, and after that I worked at an American law firm in London, and I was doing intellectual property issues across Eastern Europe, and then Europe and Africa as a whole. And I had a lot of really strange, interesting experiences in that job. But the way that it kicked off, I think it was my 3rd day on the job, my client came to me and said, you know, I think we need to go to Prague. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And they're like, well, I think our local representative there is embezzling from us, and you know, I need to go there and fire him. Will you come with me to be the lawyer? So I was like, sure, yeah, absolutely. I'll go to Prague. That sounds great. She's like, all right, we'll leave tomorrow. So we go to Prague, and we walk into the office of this very large man, reputedly ex-KGB. I don't know if that's true or not. And I'm sitting there just thinking like, oh, this is going to be an interesting experience. And my client turns to me, and she goes, I think Victoria has something that she wants to tell you. And I had not thought about this for a moment, because I thought my role was just to kind of keep my client company. Right, exactly. So I kind of stopped and then launched into this, you know, I think it's time that our relationship has come to an end. And he listens to this, and he rises up from the desk and just starts screaming in a combination of English and Czech. And then he collapses into his chair and starts sobbing. And then he starts to work himself up again, and he's starting to like rise up from the desk and start to scream again. And my client looks at me, and she goes, grab all the files on his desk and run. Oh, so we both scoop up, and we grab all the documents we can get.
Scene.
Yeah, and we're running down the streets of Prague, and he is running after us screaming. And I'm thinking, I'm at what in the United States is known as like a relatively prestigious law firm. Like, what in the world have I got myself into? Like, this job is crazy. And that job did have a lot of interesting moments over the next few years. But one of the things that I learned from that job is I actually like being in situations that are unpredictable. Like, as crazy as that moment was, there was a big part of me that was enjoying the crazy of it. And so that was something that has been, you know, as I've sort of looked through my career, looked for things where my job was going to be a little bit unpredictable, because it's something that I enjoy. A second job that had a really big impact on me was being a trade negotiator for the United States. So when I was doing trade negotiations, it was a very busy time. We negotiated 20 trade agreements and then a number of other bilateral agreements with other countries. And one of the things that was really useful to learn from that is what my own negotiating style was. And what I found is that it's really important to me to try, to the extent possible, to leave a negotiation with both sides feeling like they've gotten something out of it. I'm not a scorched earth negotiator. I like, if possible, for everyone to leave the table feeling like maybe they didn't get everything they wanted, but they got something that was important to them. And I found that I really liked talking to people that didn't agree with me, and that it was always...
Because you always learn something.
Exactly. It was the best way to learn more about what I thought, was to talk to someone that didn't agree with me. And the third thing I think I learned from that job is how important it is as a representative of the government to be a representative that your country would be proud of, that people are watching you as a representative, in my case, of the United States, and how important it was to project a good image of the United States.
Do you mean
with all
like
the
values?
countries.
More,
Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. You know, people look, other countries look to the United States, they look to France, they look for examples and they make judgments about countries based on individuals. At least that's how it felt to me. So it was really important to me to feel like I was, and I felt a lot of gratification, but also a lot of pressure to represent the United States in a way that reflected well on the United States. And the third job I'll mention is the White House. So lots of interesting
you will
memories
tell us more
from
about that.
But one, you know, one day that stands out, sort of obviously, is the first day. So my office was a brand new office at the White House. It had never existed before. It's very unusual to start any new office anywhere in the federal government. It's extremely unusual to start a new office inside the White House.
So you were the first one to do the job.
So I was the first one, and I was, when I walked in, I didn't know what to expect. And they, you know, they gave me a badge, and they essentially then took me to a room, and they said, "This is your room, this is your desk," and then they left. And because it was a very much of a startup office inside the White House, so we had no budget, we had no mandate.
Coffee at least?
No. Actually, the White House offices are very, there's no coffee, there's no water. I mean, you can buy coffee for yourself and bring it in, but there's nothing that's on offer. And I had no staff, and so I remember sitting in that chair at a desk that was blank, at walls that were blank, and for like 10 minutes, and then thinking like, no one's gonna walk in here, like it's just me. And there was probably like 30 minutes where I was like a little daunted by that. And then I was like, that's kind of great. In some ways, that means I get to decide everything that happens next, you know, like within the parameters
to
of the
do whatever you want.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I took away from that job is I really like building things and getting to think about how you get to do it the first time. And I was reasonably confident that that whatever I did, of course my successor could come in and change it, but there is so much, I don't know if apathy is the right word, people do often tend to follow what has happened before. So I knew if I set the office up in a certain way, if I engaged with the public in a certain way, if I put certain structures in place, there was a reasonably good chance that those would survive past me, which is by and large turned out to be the case. But it was a great experience in many different ways.
So you like jobs that are unpredictable, you like talking with people who don't agree, and you like building things. And is that, like, is this spirit that made you change from private to public in 2001? You were a lawyer before,
right.
and then you went to
London.
public for the White House and the USTR. What were your motivation? What did you make that move from private to public?
So that was, and again, truly like almost every job I had, sort of a lucky coincidence that it even came up as an opportunity. And I will tell you, I was actually very torn about it. I really liked living in London. I really liked the job that I had. I was very ambivalent about going. But in the end, my premise was, well, I'll go. It'll be interesting. I've never represented the US government. I've never been a trade negotiator. That will be somewhat interesting. And my plan was to do it for 2 years and then move back to London. But when I called to accept the job, I hung up the phone 5 times. Really? Because I was on the fence about whether or not I should do it. It turned out to be the best decision, one of the best decisions of my life. I loved representing the US government. I loved being a trade negotiator.
Because then you stayed like 10 years on public.
Yeah, then I never moved back to London. I've stayed in Washington since then. But I think, so, you know, one of my very, very early jobs, actually the thing that kind of started the rest of my career, was an unpaid internship at this little office inside the Department of Commerce, which is basically the office that regulates the internet. And so, and I had immensely enjoyed that. So I had like a little taste of public service before that, so I had a sense that it was of the range of issues that if you're lucky you can work on in the government, and the impact that you can have if you're willing to be really, really tenacious, because the federal government is a hard place to move. So I had a sense of that, and I thought it would be interesting, and it turned out to be actually so much more interesting than I'd even thought it would be.
Everyone must ask you this question, but I will ask you too. What is it to work with Barack Obama? What did you achieve with him? What is like, I mean...
So honestly, he's probably very much like you would expect. He's very thoughtful. He's extremely smart. And he uses that intelligence to be very thoughtful about the policy decisions he makes. He also likes having conversations with people that don't necessarily agree with what he says, so he likes to have that debate in the office. But he's very thoughtful in terms of policy and governing. He's also very thoughtful as a person, and very thoughtful to the people who work for him and the families of those people. So it was a great experience.
And what did you achieve? Like, what were your main challenges, and did you tackle all of them?
So I had three main challenges. I would say the first was just the realities of creating this new office, which I hadn't really thought about until I got into the job. And then I realized pretty quickly, so my job at the White House was to coordinate. There's 17 different agencies in the US government that work on intellectual property in some way. So my job was to coordinate with all those agencies, make sure that they were all not duplicating each other's efforts, and that they were all kind of moving forward in a way that was consistent with the administration priorities. And then to coordinate with other parts of the White House, like the National Economic Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and again, make sure that the White House and the administration as a whole were coordinated. What I didn't realize is that what that meant is that a few people in the White House and everyone in the agencies viewed me as taking their turf. So I was a threat to everyone that I engaged with on some level or another. And it was a really interesting experience. I probably spent the first 6 months of that job
Fighting with
just
everybody?
thinking about the fact that this is being recorded, but I'll just say it anyway. I probably spent 80% of my time fighting on some level with someone. But I think it was, and I did have some colleagues who would say, you know, you're the White House, like stop arguing with the agencies, just like tell them what should happen. But I think because I had been a trade negotiator, and I knew like what it was to be a civil servant and to not be a political appointee, I felt really strongly that if I take the time and I explain to people that I'm not here to take your turf, I'm here to help you, essentially, and help us all kind of work together well. And I will listen to the concerns that you have, and I will take them into account, and I will be your champion. And sometimes your agency position will lose, but you know, if you do lose, I'll always explain to you like why that happened and what the reasoning was behind it. And so it was kind of this overnight almost. There was like 6 months of pushing, but then the agencies all got on board, and then because the agencies in the U.S., maybe here too, they can really kill your political plan if they want to, if they're not bought into it.
We have the public administration for that.
But they were so bought into it, they were so enthusiastic, and so we ended up accomplishing all the goals that we set for ourselves. Two in particular that took a lot of time. One was I did a lot of working with technology companies and the entertainment industry who did not always have a good relationship. So trying to bring them together to see if there were ways that they could work together. And that sounds kind of anodyne, but it was a lot of work that went into kind of building those relationships and building that trust. And then the second thing that I spent a lot of time on was economic espionage, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for the US, but we didn't have a plan for it. So working with the agencies to come up with a plan to counter economic espionage was a big part of my time there.
Okay, thanks. You spent like 10 years in the public sector. I'd like to ask you your personal point of view about something. There are less women than men in politics, in public administration too. what is it? Is it like harder for women? I know that in France it's harder. It's or less easy to be a woman in politics. How is it in the US? Did you feel a difference?
So,
What is it like to break the glass ceiling, actually?
so there are definitely less women. Although I will say, when I was at USTR, there were a lot of senior women there.
USTR is the US Trade Office.
But in both places and in the White House, there were definitely less women. And so I guess I would say for much of my career, I've often been the only woman in the room. So I was a little bit used to it. And more the way I thought about it was women that were in more junior positions would come and ask me for advice, career advice. So I would,
mentorship.
Career advice to the extent that it was helpful. I was pregnant when I was at the White House, and one of the things that I found, so my job is Senate confirmed, and what that means is that the president appoints you, but then the Senate has to approve. And I found that there had only been one other Senate confirmed person who was pregnant in the history of the US government. When they were trying to figure out how to handle my being away, the White House counsel's office were looking for precedents, and they found apparently only one other, but 20 years before. So I think there is sort of a self-selecting there. But, so I'll end by telling a story of a time where I thought it was actually, I maybe had an advantage that a man wouldn't have, being a woman in a government job. So when I was I had a child when I was at the White House. I had a child when I was at USTR, when I was a trade negotiator. And while I was pregnant, my team was negotiating a free trade agreement with South Korea. So I wasn't the day-to-day negotiator, my team was doing it. So I had met the Korean delegation at the very beginning, when I wasn't pregnant, of the negotiation. And then I didn't see them again until we were ready to close. And we had a deadline, a congressionally set deadline, so we absolutely had to close by midnight on a certain date. And we had a lot of issues that were not yet resolved in my part of the trade agreement. So my boss, the chief trade negotiator, said, I really want you to come to Seoul to finish the negotiation. I think it needs to be you. And I was 8 months pregnant at the time. And he's like, medical care in South Korea is great, so like, don't worry about it, like, it'll all be good. And so, it was important to get it closed, and I had been telling them, don't concede anything, like, hold on to all the provisions. So I did feel a little responsible to come and close it. But the Korean delegation hadn't seen me for a year. And I'm not like a small, dainty pregnant person. I'm like a massively huge pregnant person. And so I walk in the room and I'm just enormous. And the entire, I could see their jaws just drop. They were so shocked. And I don't know, I feel
unexpected.
Like maybe the surprise is a little bit of a negotiating advantage, maybe. I don't know. But certainly it would not be a negotiating advantage that any man could have.
I have one last question about the women empowerment. You founded a summer program called Girls Who Code in Washington, D.C. I want you to tell us more about it. It's a program that educates women and support them to go to all the engineering, mathematics, science fields. Can you tell us more about it? Do you think there is a need, an urge for women to try to help women to go in tech or digital?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that we need more coders and software engineers in general. I think we need, in particular, though, to focus on groups that have been underrepresented in the community. And so women are one of those groups, but not the only group, actually. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of making sure that anyone who lives anywhere in the world that wants to have a tech job actually will have that as a viable opportunity. But certainly women are one of the groups that are underrepresented, woefully underrepresented in the tech industry. So Girls Who Code is a program that is focused on high school girls.
From 15 to 18 or
Yeah,
30?
exactly. Almost all of the girls that go into the program have never had any exposure to coding at all. It's a 7-week program, and during the course of the 7 weeks, they're taught to program robots and to build an app and to build websites and given sort of basic coding skills. And I think it's a program that I'm really excited about. But I will say, beyond the fact, and some of the girls do then go on to study computer science and become software engineers, but not all of them, which is also a good thing. One of the things that is really important to me is that the girls come out of it with a real sense of confidence. Because I think confidence is, I don't know if I say it's everything, but confidence is a lot. And
we're trying to teach this here.
So
ambition can be thought. That's one of our motto.
And when I would give advice to young women, like in the White House job, a lot of it was how to either appear to have confidence and then eventually acquire confidence. Because I think
fake it until you make it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's enormously important. But I think that's one of the things that the Girls Who Code program does, is because it teaches this new skill, which again, for most of the girls that come in, is not a skill that they've ever had, and often is a skill that their family is sort of ambivalent about, not really sure if this is something that they should be doing. So to have them come out of the program with that newfound sense of confidence is great. We also do a lot of mentoring with the girls, so we'll take them, for example, up to Capitol Hill to meet with members of Congress. We'll coach them on, this is how you talk to a member, this is how you ask a member of Congress to do something that you think is important. We've taken them and then brought a number of women leaders in the tech industry and in policy to come in to talk to them, and it's been a great program to be involved in. It's been really fun.
Now you're CEO of BSA, so you went from public to private again. Can you tell us more about this software alliance, and also why did you choose to go back to private?
So it wasn't an easy decision to leave the White House, because I was very happy there, but I knew I was a political appointee, so I knew by definition I would be leaving. And when this opportunity came up, there were two things about it that I found really appealing. One is that we are headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we have offices around the world. In fact, Thomas Bouet is here, who's the head of our European office based in Brussels. We have offices in Asia and in Latin America. And it's a very global industry, but the organization I run is a very global organization.
So just to know more about it, it's an independent organization?
Yes.
International organization?
Yes, and we work on technology policies. So we work on issues like privacy and cybersecurity and encryption and artificial intelligence and data issues around the world, with governments around the world. And most of my career other than the White House job, my White House job was probably by far the most domestic job that I had, but most of my career had been very international. So I was really excited about coming back and getting to work on international economic policy issues. And then the second thing that I was excited about was I knew enough about the industry to know that it was going through this sort of massive business model transformation, moving to cloud services and subscription. And so I thought that will be interesting to be a little bit inside of a conversation happening as this massive industry transforms itself. What I didn't know is that while that transition was happening and is continuing to happen, software companies are also more and more data companies. And so there's actually there's a business model, but then actually the business that the companies are in is transforming. So there's two massive, massive shifts going on inside the industry at the same time, and it has made this a really fascinating job to be part of that conversation. It does mean the job is somewhat, sometimes a little unpredictable, but it's been really fascinating.
At the family, we have a lot of our entrepreneurs who are creating softwares, or all of them are using it. Actually, software can make it easier to build a company. It's cheaper. So what do you think about that? Do you think like software is it's like a democratization of entrepreneurship?
I think it definitely can be, and I know the companies are also thinking more and more about how to do that, how to democratize software so it's as easy and accessible to use as possible. But in terms of software making it easier to start a company, I actually have a personal experience of that from before I had this job. My husband started a startup a while ago, and he, like many people, use cloud services instead of buying software in the more traditional way. And I remember him telling me, and again, this is before the idea of having this job had ever existed, that he would not have been able to afford to start his company if he hadn't been able to use cloud services to do it.
It's exactly the same with our companies here.
Yeah, and I hear variations of that story all the time. So I think it is, it's definitely the case.
Okay. And what is it to come from the US and to see this software industry here in Europe? Because we often say that US creates and Europe regulates. What is it to be here? What is your point of view? Are there main differences between the vision of software industry in the US and here?
So what was it? U.S. innovates and Europe regulates. I mean, I think like all catchy sayings, that's
what American people are saying.
Generalization, right? That's a bit of an overgeneralization. So there's clearly a really strong entrepreneurial spirit represented here in this room.
We're trying to
here at the family, and there's not just in France, although it's really exciting what's happening in France, but we're seeing that in a
Berlin,
number of countries.
London.
Exactly, in Berlin, where I was, I guess very early this morning. So across Europe, there's more and more of that, which is great. And I would say on the regulation side in the United States, not to talk too much about my day job, but one of the things that is part of my day job is working to try to get federal privacy regulation passed in the United States. So our companies think it would be really helpful to have a really strong standard for federal privacy legislation in the United States. So that is one of the things that we are hoping will be a trend in terms of regulation, and we're going to be working really hard to make that happen in the U.S.
One last question, and then I will let maybe public ask you the questions they want. We have heard a lot about GDPR. What are your perspectives on that, and what do you think about it in Europe? I'd love to hear your point of view about this.
So our companies our companies and us as an organization were very involved in GDPR. So I think for us, it was something that was a long time in coming. And so the companies that thought about it a lot and had, even before GDPR was passed, had thought a lot about what complying with the GDPR would look like. So I think for the companies that I work for, which are companies like Apple and Microsoft and Siemens and Salesforce and others, I think it was a transition that they had been planning for. I think in the United States, I think it was more of a surprise to some industry sectors that had been less involved in it, but do have business in Europe, and so they're sort of in the process of figuring out the changes that they're going to need to make. But I think that's a process that will sort itself out. In the U.S., as I said, we're pushing for privacy legislation, and the way I would characterize it is we would like to have something in the U.S. that was as high a standard. I think it will look different in large part because our common law system is very different than the civil code.
Yeah, and for now in Europe, it's not that user-friendly because, like, personally, I just receive many mails all the time about privacy legislation. So maybe in the US, yeah, you can do differently for that, but.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're going to need to figure out, though, is the consent and the notice. And, is there a way to try to... So we would like to have a system where we feel like consumers really understand what's happening, that they really have knowledge, and then they can use that knowledge to really control their data and not have it be able to say no to uses that they don't want. But before we even get to the control, we have to figure out the knowledge piece. And I think that's really difficult, right? To have a way of explaining to the general public, who frankly shouldn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it, what's happening to their data. And I don't think we've quite figured that out yet.
Thank you. Do you have any questions in the public? I'm gonna, yeah.
Hi, you worked on the government side, you worked at the White House, you also worked in trade. Now that you're working in private sector, I mean, you kind of have the power to enforce and create new laws and go after patents, but now that you're in private sector, what do you wish the new regulations, not just in the US, but all around the world in the software industry, what do you expect from different governments, and especially big data, privacy laws, and all these new inventions coming up? What should we also expect? If you can highlight on that.
So, I think in terms of areas where there's going to be a lot of focus, I think privacy is one, for sure. Cybersecurity is a second. Artificial intelligence is a third. There are others. Law enforcement access, encryption, workforce development, but privacy, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence, I think, are going to be big areas of focus. In terms of what I want, I mean, if I could have one thing, it would be an international consensus. And maybe that's in part because of my background as a trade negotiator, but I think the biggest problem that we have is that in every area where I work, there is no international consensus. There are no international legal rules, there are no international norms, and that causes a variety of problems, one of which is unpredictability. But an even bigger problem is actual clash and violation of laws. And I think that, data and software and technology are clearly, they're not going away. They're a big part of the European economy. They're a big part of the US economy, a big part of the Indian economy, the Japanese economy, the South Korean economy. I mean, that is not a trend that I think is going to stop. And so this deficiency, what I would consider to be a deficiency right now in our international legal system, that there are no rules and there are no consensus, that's clearly not sustainable for something that has such a big impact on the economy, not to mention such a big impact on society. But it's hard to come to international consensus. And so if I could ask for one thing, it would be international consensus. But I also know that that's probably, a 3-year, a 5-year, maybe a 10-year journey on some issues.
Go back. Thank you.
Is there any other question? Yeah, Miss?
Could you please elaborate a little bit on your business model now that you work in a private company? Because that's not that clear so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So I run a nonprofit trade association. So what we do is we bring together software companies like Siemens and Apple and Microsoft and Salesforce, and we work with them to come up with what we think are the best policy solutions. So, for example, we need to have strong privacy legislation in the United States. We need to have trade agreements that have rules on things like cybersecurity or data moving back and forth across borders. We need governments to not undermine encryption. We work with our companies to come up with those sort of policy positions that we think governments should adopt, and then we work with the governments to explain why we think those are the right outcomes.
Is there any question? Yeah.
So I've noticed that there is currently quite a big gap between the tech world and the law world. For example, my aunt is working in a company called Mediametry. They basically do surveys, and the CNIL, which is the organism in France that basically controls what companies do with people's data, forbid them to do things because they don't understand what companies can do with data. So how do you deal with the gap between the tech world and the law world?
Well, actually, I think in some ways that's probably a really good way of describing what my job is. So, we work with technology companies and software companies that are out there innovating and creating new services. And then our job is to work with governments that are making laws and policies around the world and try to bridge that gap. And so a big part of what we do is education. It will probably not surprise you to learn that many people in government around the world don't have a good sense of what's happening in technology. And that's not from bad faith, it's not where their expertise is. And so a big part of what we do is to try to explain to people that are making laws what those gaps are and why they matter, and what the downsides of not trying to bridge those gaps would be.
Thank you.
One last question, maybe? Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So in France, we're quite famous for our bureaucracy and really slow administration. I feel like this might be a problem with many governments and administrations, but what do you think that realistically governments could start acting a little bit more like private companies and startups and just working more efficiently, and what can we do to kind of move in that direction?
So that's a great question, and it's one I've thought a lot about, or a fair amount about, because of my background. So I guess I would say a couple of things. One is I chair this group at the World Economic Forum, and one of the ideas that we had in this group is whether or not we could take kind of the principles of agile software development and then apply them to the government policy-making process, understanding that making policy that impacts the citizens of a country is very, very, very different from software development, but were there principles we could learn from in terms of how you participate in the process, for example, and trying to break down some of the organizational silos. So this idea of agile governance is one that I actually think has a lot of promise. And I think there are definitely ways that governments could work more efficiently. The second thing I'll say, and I never figured this out while I was in government, but I think it's definitely something that needs to be figured out. So I thought one of the big problems that I had as a policymaker is that it was really hard to get information from the public in terms of what that they were interested in. And actually, I remember when I started at the White House, I went to talk to our Office of Science and Technology Policy, and this is the problem I have. This is such a tech-forward administration. I'm sure you guys have a great answer to this. Give me the technology tool that I need so that I can get all the input that I want from the public. And it turned out we didn't have that technology tool. So my analog way of doing it was just meet with people. I had a tiny, tiny travel budget, and I spent every dollar of it traveling around the United States, meeting with people that agreed with me, and trying to meet with as many people who disagreed as possible, and then meeting with people in Washington. But I think that, not just for the U.S. government, I think the ability to really understand what the citizens are thinking, what they really care about, is very, very difficult. And the processes that governments have for getting that information are very antiquated. And not user-friendly. And I think the Obama administration tried, there was this we the people idea, but it's clearly not something that's been figured out. And then the second part of that is that I think it's very hard, or it's not as clean as it should be for governments to explain back to citizens why they made the decisions that they made. And so I think there's a big input problem in terms of getting the views, which I think anyone who's in government for the right reasons is there to serve the citizens. So they have a real interest in wanting to know what the public thinks, but it's really hard to find that out in an accurate way. And then having better mechanisms to convey back to the public what decision government has made, why they made those decisions, what they think the impact of those decisions are going to be. And I'm hopeful that someone, and I'd love to be part of that process, I feel like this is something that absolutely needs to be figured out.
Working on it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Does anyone have another question? No? Thanks a lot, Victoria, for this fireside chat. Thank you for being here. Que l'enfant
la famille.